Thank you so much. All right. Looks like we have members present: Ms. Autry, Dr. Hall, Superintendent James, Mr. Bravo, Mrs. McKittrick, and I see a 614 number that may be media or a visitor. So welcome.
Hey Ryan, that number is me. My computer audio has been kind of fritzing in and out, so it was just easier for me to dial in as well as video in as well.
Oh, great. Okay, well, welcome to you too, to both of you.
Okay.
Okay. All right, we didn't have a lot on today's agenda, but really, this is about as big a topic as we can navigate in school funding is the 5-year forecast. So for today's meeting, I really wanted to go over the purpose and the importance, especially with COVID-19 planning, of the 5-year forecast, what to expect for next week in terms of the presentation and the adoption of the forecast, getting your input in terms of what you want to see, what your fellow board members want to see, what you think the community wants to see. I'll take you through the basics of my presentation, and the superintendent and other board members that have seen this presentation will know that kind of what charts to look for and, you know, the highlights. But spending as much time on COVID-19 levy planning, comparison, or trends that you want to do. And then at the end, I just have a quick review on approving a 403B vendor for next Monday, so that you have a chance to review that contract, talk about the cost, and welcome, Dr. Akbar.
Hello, Ryan, everybody.
Yep, welcome. And so to our committee members, does that sound like a plan? What other items on today's agenda did you want to talk about, or do you just kind of want to save that as we go through the presentation basics?
Yeah, I'm fine.
Hey, Ryan, this is Derek. I mean, I would echo Diana. Yeah, I'm fine. Let's just walk through it.
Let's get into the forecast, and you'll have lots of questions, and please don't hesitate, because that will help strengthen the presentation next week in terms of what you want to see, the community wants to see, and trending. And then you see the basics of the presentation. We can discard sections, enhance other sections. So please don't hesitate.
Well, hey, Ryan. Hey, Ryan. I'm sorry, Ryan. I did have one thought. I'm sorry.
Hey, Derek, your audio is on your computer and your phone.
Oh,
and there's
okay.
A lot
okay. Let me see if I can. Let's see. How about now? Is it better?
That's great.
Okay. So in thinking about what the community is going to want to see or hear, you know, I know what the budget cuts. I mean, and I'll you know, want to hear what others think as well. But my thought is that they're going to want to hear sort of, okay, we have this series of cuts that have been announced by the states. You know, how granular can we be in talking about how those cuts are going to impact, you know, various programs, right? So there's always the questions from, you know, folks that, you know, that are advocates of Miller South. You know, I think there's always sort of a latent sort of fear that Miller South is, you know, always going to be the cutting, the cutting block, you know, which is not the case. But again, right. I think assuages some of those concerns. And then again, I just think talking globally around sort of, you know, where do we think these cuts are going to impact, sort of whether it's schools, programs, et cetera. I think that's probably at least what I'd be looking for as a community member. Like, is a given program at my school going to be cut or impacted by this program? I mean, maybe that's too granular for for next week, as far as, perhaps we won't have that level of detail sort of baked in by then. But just as we start thinking about it, that was sort of one of the questions I got asked yesterday about something like, well, they saw that there were cuts, and they were asking like, well, how is this going to impact, the schools, and what program services are potentially at risk due to these cuts? And I obviously, I can't really speak to that because we haven't had those conversations yet.
Right. Yeah, those questions, even if it is too granular right now, those are great questions to ask now or in session, because people are wondering about that, and it may be too early to know what programmatic cuts are going to be because we don't have next year or fiscal 21's budget reductions. But people want to know that we're talking about it, we're planning, and I think those are very reasonable questions to ask. And I do not believe, just to that one, we will know by next Monday what the state budget reductions for the 2021 school year will be. Superintendent and I are expecting those in the next few weeks. Could push a little bit longer, but the legislature, as he and I were on a lobbying call today, is trying to get their arms around, and the state agencies' arms around, so many different things. The list is extremely long, as you can imagine, both in your professional and daily lives. It's that way for the schools, whether it's transportation or food service or the licensure of teachers or working conditions or you name it. The list is a mile long. So
yeah, and then Ryan, I think a part two there would be, I saw the email that was put out last week as well, sort of about what the budget cuts sort of translate. I think this was David that put this out. That it really translates into a 21% reduction as far as payments that we received for the last 2 months of the fiscal year. Sort of, I think the other question that I know I had, and it maybe could come up next week, and that is, what does that mean practically for this fiscal year? That as it wraps up. What's the impact of those cuts being what they are for these last 2 months of the year? Like, how's that impacting, if at all, sort of current operations or programs for the rest of this fiscal year?
That's great. I'm writing these down, and hopefully throughout tonight's presentation, we'll get those answered. And then again, you'll see the framework of the PowerPoint, and we'll make sure to insert that. So Mrs. McKittrick and Dr. Akbar, anything else from you before we get rolling through? And Mr. Bravo?
I do have a question, and I hope it's not a stupid question. So the money that's coming from the CARES Act, since we've already made expenditures to help kids with APS online learning, is there a refund that occurs, or how can we apply those monies to things that we've already done, monies that we've already spent?
It's a great question, not a stupid question at all. It's ones that school administration and boards are looking for those answers every day. So here's what we know. We know that the CARES Act funding can be retroactively applied to qualifying expenditures to March 13th. So yes, we can issue refunds, quote unquote, to our general fund and other potential grants. We're waiting on the grants question for some more clarity, but just this afternoon, Ohio Department of Education released guidance that we can supplant the CARES Act funding, which means in basic or layman's terms, we can go back and apply that to any source that was the original expenditure, as well as expenses that we weren't expecting. So increased hotspots would be covered by this. But let's say we had Title I pay for some software that we do every year that's going to help us navigate disaggregating data in report cards going forward. CARES Act, with a supplant ruling like this, we can apply that funding towards that. Now, we don't have all the specifics. That guidance just came out today, but it's the most flexible guidance that we've seen. And to the extent we're saving general fund money, to the extent we're saving federal grant money, and the rules have been loosened up about rolling over larger cash carryovers into next fiscal year, that's the best case scenario that we can. And then so back to Dr. Hall's point, what's the practical implication? So we'll walk through that today. What's the practical implication of the budget cuts this year, knowing what we know now into next year's finances? Hopefully that's the story that we're going to be telling. Good question. Any other questions before we jump in?
So I know I was about 2-3 minutes late. Just to get understanding based off the email previously. So we're talking about the 5-year forecast, where we are, and Levy Timeline. Is that the?
I think the relevant question on Levy, we can talk about the Levy Timeline. I sent out the memo just because we had been talking so much publicly about it with our in-house counsel. I wanted to make sure that the board knew, as it relates to your future conversations, that what exactly the adoption dates of the 2 resolutions have to be for us to get it filed. So you can start with that endpoint in mind and back up your conversations. There are components of the levy that are relevant to the 5-year forecast, but I wasn't going to focus my energies on the quote unquote levy and or millage. But certainly it is related to the forecast because it's a major component of our revenue or not. So I think that there's always a levy question during my forecast presentations. But I hadn't planned on having a whole section or set aside of just levy talk.
Yeah, and again, Ryan, I think that makes sense for the time being. I think, you know, to Dr. Akbar's, I think probably a larger point is, we really do need to start at some point talking about, sort of the levy process, sort of what those steps look like. And I understand that the last time around that we didn't really get started until like July, maybe even August. But I know that we're in the middle of May right now, and before we know it, it's going to be July and August. And so I do know, I will admit to a certain apprehension that we haven't had or begun those conversations yet. And so, but to your point, as far as today's meeting is concerned, I get that that's not sort of a major part of the end of the day. But I think we could all agree that it's something that we need to start talking about sooner rather than later.
Definitely.
So can I ask one last question and then I'll let you finish?
Helpful.
Does the levy conversation begin in the finance committee, or can that be scheduled separate?
No, I think it can begin with the entire board. It can be detailed in the finance committee, but I've heard, and I'll defer to the superintendent, but there's been enough of this discussion about whether or not to go on in November that the committee of the whole is absolutely a place where we can have and probably should have that conversation. The committee of the whole and or board wants to say to finance committee, hey, can you give us scenarios of 6.9 to 8.9 millage rates, and what's the impact of that? And oh, by the way, when next year's state budget cuts, does that give us any relief? But I'll turn it back over to you guys, because we can make that in terms of discussion item for the board. I see Patrick unmute there, and the superintendent's on. So go ahead. I'll turn it over to you guys.
Yeah, I think to the questions that are being asked and the points that are being made, I would also like to see us schedule a whole board conversation where we can at least delegate to the relevant committees those parts that are important about the levy to start talking about and making decisions on. But I know we've kind of pushed this off a little bit because of COVID. and giving you guys some space to figure out how to navigate and operate. But I do think, to NJ and Derek's points, I'd really like to see us schedule some time. I don't know if it's appropriate to take up an entire regularly scheduled meeting, but perhaps we could look at getting a special meeting scheduled within the next week or two to at least have that initial discussion. Because like NJ said, and we've seen this happen before too, like we're in the middle of May. I can't believe it's the middle of May already, and
Right.
June's right around the corner. So I would also like to see us get that scheduled if we could start tossing them around some dates for a special meeting.
Yeah, I agree. And in light of the requirements that we have in terms of the two resolutions, I would rather not pass those resolutions in too close a time frame where we can't explore all of the financial options. So honestly, I know there's a public component to this that we need to have conversation and protect, but the sooner we start getting into the details of what kind of operating fund requests we're going to need in terms of millage will help us in that planning. So,
well, unless you or the superintendent object, why don't I work with you guys and NJ to start tossing some dates out there, and maybe we can at least, and that way people feel comfortable too, knowing that, we've been focused over here, but our eye's not off the ball in terms of the levy. Let's get something scheduled.
Yeah, that would be helpful. Thank you. Okay. Thanks for the questions. That was very helpful because it helps me see what items of focus you want to get into with the forecast presentation. So I'm going to share my screen. And as we go through the share screen, don't stop and say, hey, we get it. Spend more time here. Don't spend as much time here. Really sharpen where you want this presentation to go for next week. Oh, wrong one, wrong button. A window. I'll confirm when we, does everybody see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, somebody's gonna have to give me an audible because I can't see anybody. I can only see my
Yes,
screen.
I can see it too.
Okay, great. So this is the 5-year forecast template, and I'll walk you through some PowerPoint. These are my notes. This is the basics of the presentation. We have how this aligns to our overall district purpose. And if you notice down at the bottom where my mouse is, it really is a foundational component or a building block of all of district operations, right? It's the budget, the budgeting process, the appropriations, and the proper funding. We can't fund the programs that we want to fund for our children. So that's where it fits into the overall strategic plan. Is everybody able to see this slide a little bit?
Well, now.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, great. So along with the notes that I just took from your questions about budget reductions, the practical implications, can we expect any kind of programmatic cuts? How does the CARES Act have a practical implication into this school year and to next? And what do we want to protect and why? And ultimately, how does this forecast reinforce the need for future revenue, i.e. levy? And so these are my notes here. This will obviously look a little bit cleaner, but you can see how I've started to scope this out based from our notes in terms of the purpose of the 5-year forecast and kind of what's led the forecast. So just as a quick reminder, and maybe new to those board members starting in January, the 5-year forecast is a twice a year annual financial planning tool. It is the financial planning tool of school districts in Ohio, but it serves a deeper purpose than what it's originally intended to do 15 plus years ago. This is a living, breathing document month to month where we reconcile approximately $350 million of general fund revenue and expenses. And then it provides 3 years of history and 5 forward years of estimates. You'll hear treasurers from time to time give a couple cynical comments that we're the only government agency that budgets out 5 years, which is a true statement. When you think about our city counterparts in government, they're 1 to 2 years. So the confidence level that we have going out past 3 years starts to diminish. What it is, I would ask you, and I think what board members that have seen this before know, it's less about the finite numbers out in year 4 and 5. It's more about the trend analysis. So we'll talk a little bit about the statutory requirements for the 5-year forecast. And then ultimately, I think from our one-on-one meetings early on before COVID hit, I think we had a chance to do this with all the board members. The 5-year forecast is, there's a section of statute that relates to our ability to sign contracts. And the best example of this is negotiated agreements. And if you don't have the availability of funds out, I think it's over $500,000, or out in some future year where you're showing a negative fund balance, then you are not, the treasurer is not allowed by law to sign that contract. And that seems to be pretty black and white, but it's not just the signature part that's important. It's the discussion getting up to that. It's the trend analysis getting up to that. And then we see in the first section, you see what's really factored into our financial planning for decades. Really, it's been more than 10 years, has been enrollment. And we'll talk a little bit about enrollment and how that's stable. Obviously, the major impact for this 5-year forecast, unprecedented in any other one, is COVID-19 planning. And I'll go through a little bit of month-to-month comparison or property tax impacts, and then a lot of the questions. Then we'll look at some comparisons. I always like to finish the presentation with, well, what did you say would happen in October and how is it different? You know, the goal is not to try to make them match. The goal is to say, did we make reasonable assumptions in October? Did we make reasonable assumptions today? And what decisions do we have to make accordingly? And then strengthening with the historic trends. So let's see here. So these are some notes for me. I've got some better graphs that you'll see. Uncertainty in forecasting. What's different about this forecast than others as we look at all of our revenue and all of our expenses is, as those of you on Finance Committee know, we're tracking our month-to-month expenses. We're running about $500,000 a month under budget. It's not substantial to our overall budget, but it'd be nice to talk about some of those highlights of where we are running under budget, whether it be building supplies. Is it going to swing back to the other side, and are we going to have an increase like what may happen in health insurance? And then the uncertainty of forecasting of state, local, and ultimately our cash balance. The state, one of our state colleagues is talking about a crisis of known unknowns. And the caution has been, hey, be careful not compounding what you don't know. Meaning, we do know that the state and other government agencies taken approximately 20, and in some cases, there's been more than 25% budget reductions. So should we automatically assume a 25% budget reduction and submit a 5-year forecast with a 25% budget reduction? No, we shouldn't. We should budget what we know now, and hopefully throughout the presentation, the board will have an option to see what potential impacts between a 5 and a 20% budget reduction from the state looks like. Here are some of the charts that I like to include just so that the board can see what percentage of state funding in real estate, kind of, I can do a pie chart or this bar chart, and then what the average annual growth rate of revenue is going to be. So I'll do some kind of component of this chart, or maybe a 5-year historical chart, and I'll do the same thing for expenses. And we'll take probably no more than 10 minutes to say, okay, does everybody know that we received the majority of our revenue from the state. Everybody know that we receive the majority of the second largest component of our revenue from local real estate. And then the question is, hopefully from the board, is a great time to interrupt there and say, well, what's at risk, Ryan? And we talk through the risk of COVID-19, the 3.5% or the cumulative 22% budget reduction in state funding that Dr. Hall mentioned. And we'll put it, so we don't need to do it today unless you really want to know. I'll put it into numbers during the presentation next week to say, okay, it was $3.5 million of cuts. It could have been 7 million, and here's why it wasn't. We do the same thing with salaries and benefits and expenditures. So the majority of our expenses in any one school district in the state of Ohio made this claim quite a lot. Between 70 and 80% of all expenses in a K-12 institution is salary and benefits. And you can see those charts support that. And then the next largest line item in gray there is purchase service. And that's because we have such a large portion of choice. So those are students that are leaving the district for charter, community, and open enrollment. That expenditure hits our books under purchase service. And we can follow up the same question, should be followed up to this section too on expenses. So what practical implications are there as a result of COVID to our expenditures? And that's right now, that's a fairly easy answer because we've been tracking month-to-month expenses, and we'll hit a couple of those highlights, but it's a fairly easy answer because we have protected the employees in the district by extending their compensation in as routine a fashion as possible through the end of the school year. And obviously, you know that from the board resolution. So it does not have a major impact on our budget. So let me pause there, open that up for questions for now.
Hey, Ryan. Yeah, this is Derek. I just had a quick question. So the purchase service component, you mentioned that was basically sort of looking. My recollection was that that's a sort of a pass through for, and I think you said this as well. This is for the kids who open enroll outside the district. This is that pass through as far as where those dollars go. Is that also inclusive of folks who are on voucher programs with private schools as well?
It is. It's vouchers, private schools, charter schools, community schools, electronic schools, and open enrollment out. Because what in a sense the accounting is supporting is somebody makes a choice to educate elsewhere, that school district is virtually billing us for a service they're providing for a kid that would otherwise come to Akron Public Schools. So that's why it's called a purchase service, or that's why it's in that line item of budget.
Great, thank you.
Yes. And that's why it's such a large portion of our expenditures. This peaked about 5 years ago at over $32 million a year. So that was 10% of our budget at the time. Any other questions about the statutory requirements of the forecast, the purpose of the requirements, a little bit of trend analysis? This is an interesting chart. Sometimes it brings out the doom and gloom, but it really is, there's some bright parts when you look at 2016, 2015 to current days, is that this enrollment trend, if you back up 30, 40, 50 years, has been on the decline. And this leveling off, and even in 16, 17, 18, we were increasing enrollment as those students who were leaving for choice were coming back to us. That was an extremely bright point. Live birth rates aren't going down as fast in the Akron area. They're still going down slowly, but there's still approximately 27,000 students available to come to Akron Public Schools, as there were about a decade ago. So this is really a choice chart. And any questions on what we've covered up to this point?
Hey, Ryan, this is Derek. I just had a clarifying question. You mentioned that the purchase services peaked at 32 million at one point in the past, and you sort of said that was about 10% of the budget. So when we're talking about budget, you're not talking about that sort of that all-in number. That's that's at 550. You're talking about sort of the general fund budget, which is at that 380 number.
That's correct.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
That's a great point, and I've strengthened that up front. So the 5-year forecast includes our general fund revenues and expenses and our permanent improvement. It does not include federal grants or construction funds. That's a great question.
Could you say that again, what it includes, please?
That's our general fund revenue and expenses. It does not include state, local, or federal grants. Most obviously what we receive is federal grants. It does not include, it does have health insurance. That's a major component of it. It does not have construction funds.
But for Ryan, for our general purposes, generally speaking, when you're talking about the budget, you're talking about that, again, that 380 number, which is general fund, revenue, expenses, health insurance. You're not, that. So as we're talking in sort of general sort of parlance, when you're saying budget, you're referring to that sort of that smaller 380 number.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, construction funds. It's easy to reference construction funds, just a high level, that those are funds that are partnered with the state of Ohio and encumbered for a finite project. We do not have to raise money for that. That money is in the bank. That money is in the bank from the state. That partnership's agreed. The contracts are agreed. In fact, now we're in the final segment 6, and those projects are encumbered. And we're staying under budget to the available funds that we have. And I'm sure once we get closer to segment 6, midway, Finance Committee will take a deeper look into those funds as well. Similar is the federal grants, right? We get the federal grant allocation every year. They really don't. There's really not a lot of distortion from year to year in terms of what those allocations are, because they're a lot like Title I's based on need. And so I'm not having 7-figure swings in federal grants. So those funds are known up front before the school year, and then they're budgeted and encumbered throughout the year. And so there's not a lot of swing in those. So any other question about the purpose of the forecast, why we do it, its uses for you in the community, kind of the trend of expenses and revenue, and then I'll get into a couple more graphs here at the end. And what I'll do is spend the rest of my time this week and next strengthening our questions regarding the practical, I really like the way that was phrased, the practical implications of what we know this school year and next in terms of budget reductions and programmatic components. Any other questions before we jump into a little bit more?
Hey, Ryan, this is Derek. I just have one comment. As you know, finance to a certain degree is an art form, right? It really is a function in a lot of ways of what assumptions you make. In my experience on the corporate side, you can get to any number you want to with the right assumptions. Now, to your point earlier, some of them are not very reasonable assumptions. So we sort of get, so what we get judged upon as far as our abilities is our ability to use reasonable assumptions to project in the short and the long term. So I just want to say thank you and applaud that you sort of pointed that out repeatedly in our meetings, both past as well as in the present meeting as well. And just sort of, and for everybody else that's on the call, this is an art. And so when you have somebody with Ryan's skill set, this is really a function of his ability to sort of come up with, as he puts it, reasonable assumptions, but that is not easy to do.
But I appreciate that. I guess I would just add, please know that this is as much our forecast as the district's forecast, as the community's forecast, as the union's forecast. And I know the superintendent, since the day that I got here, I meet with all bargaining groups, and they have the ability to question the assumptions we are making. And I know our board president and I have debated for many years about reappraisal cycles, property value increases. So what I do very much welcome to that point, Dr. Hall, is if there is an assumption that somebody doesn't know and or doesn't agree with as they're reading the notes to the forecast, I welcome that. I really do welcome the questioning, the debate, the challenging, because the forecast only gets stronger as a result of that. So I thanks for those comments. Okay, as we move through the overall purpose of the forecast, revenue and expenses, what the snapshot looks like in today's terms, we also want to frame in to the general public as we potentially set up the need for a future levy is what's it all mean when you say you close your books with a $50 million cash balance, right? And so we do need to put it in perspective because $50 million is a lot of money. And you can see some notes on the bottom of this chart. I start to detail that. So GFOA recommends a minimum cash balance of no less than 2 months general operating expenses. And we've debated this in Finance Committee for years. Is that even enough, right? If you're thinking about your personal finances and what best practices is 2 months enough? Is 2 months enough in this scenario? 1 month's payroll, just to put it into perspective, is about 15, that's anywhere from between 12 and $15 million with where we're at in the fiscal year. Lighter in the summer, obviously heavier during the school year. This chart really resonates, I think, with a lot of folks to say, okay, Pendleton, we get it. $50 million isn't a great thing. Where are we at in that cash cycle? So you see our annual budget, $380 million. Cash reserve policy in fiscal 2022 is about 22 to 27 million. Obviously, that's varied based on when we hit the go button on the forecast. 10% of our budget would be 38 million. Our highest month's expenses is 35 million. And just to put in perspective, what 1 month of local tax collection looks like is 29 million. So when you think about even that GFOA 2 months, if these were my own personal home expenses, I would rather have 3 to 6 months cash on hand. And then obviously our current cash balance out on the right. And I will update these numbers to the most recent. We're using last forecast because I'm trying to get them as close as possible for decision making moving forward. This is a busy chart, but you can see the cash balances moving out. And I think I'm going to do a line chart on this one because it's too busy.
And Ryan, can I just add something about if you go back to the cash balance? So many of you know too that we have a cash balance, a cash reserve policy in place now that is relatively newer because we did not used to have one, but following the levy campaigns, I should say, in 2011 and 2012, when we were facing about a cumulative $84 million deficit, one of the things that we wanted to do as a finance committee to help ensure that we were also being good stewards of public money was to set a reserve to say, look, and I wanted it to be a little stronger than I think it is now. Right now, it is a cash reserve policy, but there are essentially no teeth. But we really wanted it to say, or the original thought that I brought behind it was, I want to say that here is a cash reserve, a minimum that we will not go below or that we will not budget below without us taking some additional action, because we just to try and push or encourage that strong sort of look at spending before we head to those deficit years. We know the deficit years are inevitable, but how far can we push them out? We might be able to encourage or push them out a little further if we set a policy that says we won't go below this cash reserve without the board coming back. Again, there aren't a whole lot of teeth in that right now. And as Ryan said, we went very conservatively low on that because I think we all agreed at the time that the cash reserve policy should set a higher limit based on what you just heard from Ryan about highest month's expenditures, average property tax collections, all that kind of stuff. But anyway, I just thought I'd throw some context behind that. I think it's a great policy. I think it's still a little low. It probably still lacks a little teeth to try and encourage future boards and future executive leadership teams to really stay within, to the extent possible and for as long as possible, their annual budgets. But anyway, just want to throw that out there.
Yeah, good follow-up and point.
Hey Ryan, just for myself, just from my own subjective, when we're talking about the 2 months of general operating expenses, yeah, I guess I'm used to sort of expressing it as days cash on hand.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm spending this forward to next week. You know, folks who might be listening in, you know, I mean, just from a vocabulary standpoint, maybe days cash on hand might be another way that we express it. Along with that, not suggesting to replace it, but and
I will do that. Yeah, I can
put it in those terms. 60 days cash on hand. Wow, like that's, you know, we're gonna, to Patrick's point, we're gonna have to come back to the cash reserve policy because, you know, I just have no comfort level at all with 60 days of cash on hand. Not you know, when you sort of see it on. I mean, I think we're 265 days cash on hand. You know,
right.
by comparison, right? I mean, so and we're larger budget, but still, I mean, we're 4 or 5 times the days cash on hand and for twice the budget size. So
right on.
So all right.
Yeah, and so I will end the presentation minus what we're going to enhance on the COVID-19 components, which I'm assuming we'll spend a good 15 minutes on the COVID-19 components and questions. This will be the snapshot of the 5-year forecast. I just wanted you to see those board members who went through the orientation with me and David in the very beginning remember seeing these numbers. And as we negotiated contracts, you remember seeing these numbers. And these, just so you know, these change almost every day. And Dr. Akbar asked that question of the budget deficit for the current fiscal year and kind of, hey, Ryan, when you're getting close to the May forecast, you know, can you please pay particular attention to where we're at in terms of the deficit? But really the important part is not this year's, you know, break even or deficit, which we've been fortunate to do for about 3 years now. We've been able to balance that budget. But as you see, that chart really gets turned upside down quickly. So the question as it relates to levy and levy discussion, planning and talk will be, how much more can we do to this trend, what I've got highlighted, to lessen the amount of future impact? And so after we do the May 5-year forecast and what we'll have for the levy planning is we will have an interactive chart that has a little bit more detail than this. And you see the bar chart with the cash reserves. Everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
We'll have an interactive chart. So as the board and administration begin to model what if we receive this budget reduction from the state, we'll see an immediate impact. And then if we say, well, what if we make this budget reduction? So the board will be able to model live time what we can do with our finances in terms of addressing this deficit, ultimately steering towards a November levy or a 2021 levy, and make the best decision available that we can. Just so everybody knows, this is the abbreviated forecast. I want everybody to be able to see ultimately what you'll be approving next week is a format that looks like this. Now, I know those are fairly small, and you will get an advanced copy of this before the weekend with all of my notes, assumptions, the abbreviated forecast, a copy of the presentation, and this format: previous 3 years, future 5 years. The top section is revenue.
Hey, Ryan,
Yes.
I'm sorry. And it could be my screen is frozen, but on slide 15, it looks like that's the forecast that you submit to the state.
Correct.
What
That's
was the
this
screen at slide 12? So I just wanted to make sure that we were looking at the right thing.
okay. It must be frozen on your end because I was actually showing a full spreadsheet of what the actual forecast looks like, which I am right now.
Which is slide 15, correct?
No. Right now, what I'm showing, and I don't know if somebody can chime in if they see the large spreadsheet.
No, I see what looks like. I see what looks like slide 15, Ryan.
It says
the previous
forecast right at the top, and
forecast.
Okay, hold on.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I'm
Let
saying.
me,
Are you supposed to be looking at another slide? Or,
yep. Let me
Yeah.
show that one. Hold on.
Thanks. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you called me out because what I was doing was only showing a window. So let me show the entire screen. Hold on.
Yeah, my bad. I was trying to follow, and I'm like, okay, I don't think he's talking about this.
No, it was helpful that you got me. Okay. Does everybody see this
yes.
colossal spreadsheet?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. This is actually what you're approving. This is the document. Now, the document's going to be accompanied more in writing and graphs and charts and assumptions, but this is the document. This is, if you see all those tabs down here, this is what drives the forecast. Thank you, Dr. Akbar, for catching me. So this section references revenue, previous 3 years, future 5 years, and all the accounting components. So property tax, public utility, obviously we don't have an income tax, state aid are these two sections, and then restricted aid and or all other operating revenue. Expenses are listed here. Personnel, retirement and benefits, purchase service, supplies and materials, and capital. And those are the trends throughout here. And those are driven by assumptions. Obviously, we're getting close to finalizing the fiscal 20. So, right, we have 1.5 months left to close the fiscal year. So in terms of confidence, I have a very high level of confidence for fiscal 20 minus some unknowns with COVID expenses. I do believe I know what we will receive for the rest of the year on revenue. These numbers I'm fairly confident in. There will be a little bit of unknown with the expenses.
Hey, Ryan, this is Derek. So for 2020, is that forecast inclusive of 9 months, 10 months?
Good question. We're reconciled through April. I just finished, closed the books. So April numbers are in here. I will include as much of May as I can by next week. That's why, like, especially in COVID planning, I like to get as much of May under our belt so that we have a good tool for next school year. This line 6.01, if you remember from the previous charts and from our early orientation days, this is the really important part of the chart because it talks to you about whether or not you're balancing a budget. Just so I know I showed this in January to a few of you, let's go back and take a quick look. And I may make a chart about this if you think it's helpful. You see this chart is back to 2014.
Yes.
You see back, remember that that crude chart I drew on the board where he said, you know, the expense chart is here, the line item chart's here, the revenue line item chart's here. When they intersect, that's the point that we need to pay special close attention to. So when we're building our cash reserves, just to put into perspective, as people look at a $64 million cash balance on our books, which is high, relatively speaking to what we had coming out of 2012 when we had the last levy. But look how much we were adding to our cash balance. The highest we had in the last 7 years, was 13 million. And so as Patrick did a nice job of framing what the cash reserve policy is, that's not even 1 month's salary for the district. So I just think that's an interesting chart here. I'll try to clarify that. And then this is our cash balance. And again, just to drive home the chart here. Okay, am I back on the PowerPoint? Does everybody see that slide 13?
Yeah, it's cash balance, the benchmark comparison.
Yes.
Yeah, very good. Just to put into perspective what a couple of years out and $20 million means, during that school year, the months of January and July, we will have to be borrowing money to make cash flow. Even though you finish on June 30th with 25 or 27 million or 30 million, whatever it is, that is still a very low number. And remember, we get our property tax collections in waves. And in the month of January and in the month of July, they're very low collections. So let me just show that to you so you know what it looks like. There it goes. Does everybody see the blue bar chart there?
Yes.
Okay. So our ending cash balance is the bar charts in the current cash benchmark is what is set. And that's a flexible amount. I'll update this chart too, but you see January and June. There's not a lot of flexibility in these numbers. So what if see if I can put 38 million. The 38 million, see how much condensing that does on our current budget? There's not a lot of wiggle room when we think about how much cash on hand we have. Again, this is framing for the public at large. It says, well, when you have the cash carryover that you do, 60 million, why do we need to be talking about levy? Okay. I'll stop there, take a drink of water. We've been going for almost an hour, and I have one 403B. But obviously, I'll strengthen the components related to COVID-19, the planning, the CARES Act. Just let me, before I pause again, sorry about that. Here's what we know about budget reductions and about revenue received. And this will be a chart or two. What we know is there's been a cumulative cut to K-12 education for the months of would be May and June, cumulative percentage cut of 22% of those 2 months. Annualized, that equals about 3.5%. At the tall end, we were expecting to receive about a $7 million budget cut to May and June. That was a pretty substantial cut. The governor's office and the department, through the Department of Education, which I will say and give credit to the superintendent of public instruction, his staff, they applied a wealth factor. I will show you how they applied a wealth factor. And our current budget reduction for this year stands at 3.5 million, not 7. So those districts who were able to afford more took a larger percentage cut than those districts that were in greater need. And I will show that. So I wanted to publicly thank the Department of Education for advocating in very similar means to what House Bill 305 was a needs-based funding model. So I very much appreciate that. So our current cut stands at 3.5%, or I'm sorry, 3.5 million. That is 1% of our overall budget. Even so, can we absorb that? Yes. We may be able to offset that with our month-to-month budgeting numbers that we're seeing under budget, and I'll subtotal those for you. So at least through the March and April, we were about $1 million under budget. So can we expect to be $2 to $2.5 million under budget throughout the remainder of the year? That's possible, yes. Here's what we know about CARES Act funding. Received almost $11 million in CARES Act funding, of which we received the guidance today that we can likely supplant the vast majority of those. $1.2 million will be transferred to non-publics as we're required to serve those agencies. And we had that discussion last week. So of the $9 million or so that we have available, those to Ms. McKittrick's question, we can go back to March 13th to code expenses and or rebate those funds, which may further lessen our general fund burden, allowing us to balance the budget for this year. The major question that is the unknown, of which we need to plan for and model, of which I will model for the board on Monday, is whether or not we receive a 5, 10, 15, or 20% reduction in state aid. And between the superintendent and I, we should hear that within the next few weeks. David, are you hearing anything else as to when we might know those numbers?
No, I think it'll most likely be within the next couple of weeks.
Okay. All right. Now I'll pause. I promise.
Hey, Ryan, this is Derek. So I follow that there's a $3.5 million cut, over now that's now that was total over the last 2 months, $3.5 million, or was that $3.5 million per month?
It is $3.5 million total. It will take place over 2 months of payments. We get our payments from the state twice a month. They'll take $3.5 million out over 4 payments.
Gotcha. Okay. And that $3.5 million, applying the annualized percentage, that is what is equal to 1%. When you're about annualized number, that's 1%, right?
1% of our budget.
Right.
That is, let me see here.
Yeah, I was just clarifying that when you were saying the 1%, that was the annualized equivalent to the 3.5 million.
Yes.
Okay, gotcha. So my follow-up question then is, with regard to the CARES Act funding, I think you said that there was $10 million that we were going to receive through the CARES Act funding that could be used retroactive. I think you said sometime in March.
Yes.
So I'm assuming. So when you say that, it sounds like we may not be able to use all 10 million because we may not have enough. 10 million in appropriate. Well, it'd be 8.8 million because 1.2 is a pass through, right?
Right.
Is that right? Okay. So
it's it would be
like 8.8.
No, I think, let me see here. 10, 9. Yes, 2. Yeah, we should receive approximately 9.7. We received almost $11 million, just shy of $11 million.
9.8.
And that's minus the 1.2. I'm sorry. That's before you take out the 1.2, correct?
Correct. So our funds available to us about 9.7
Should
million.
be 9.8.
All right, gotcha. Okay. And then, so my question then is, so, what are your thoughts? How much of the 9.7 are we actually going to be able to draw down? And my assumption then is that, let's say hypothetically, let's just say that we could draw down the entire 9.7, right? I doubt we'll be able to, but if we could, then even despite the $3.5 million cut, we would still come out ahead $6 million approximately. Am I reading that right?
Yes, that's
okay.
A very good question of what we can draw down yet.
Okay. But
that is a question. We don't know the answer to that. I do know that the Ohio 8 districts and I are meeting every Thursday morning. And this last week we included Aaron Roush, Deputy Director of Finance for ODE, in our meeting so that he could see what, actually it's Cincinnati, Columbus, Toledo, Akron, and Cleveland, so that he could see what we are asking for, the guidance as to whether or not we can code for expenses. So we're all running a tabulated list, and ODE is to yet issue that guidance. So we don't know exactly, is what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
I don't know that
But
we're going to know that by.
Right.
I have
Roger
a
that.
question too.
But it's-
So this,
I'm sorry about.
sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just saying, but assuming that we could draw down the 9.7, the 9.7 minus 3.5, we still could come out $6 million ahead, hypothetically. Is that accurate? Okay,
Yes.
gotcha. Okay.
My question is the 10.7 a one-time disbursement? Do you think there will be more, or this is what you get, figure out how you're going to best use it?
Okay, this is where at the very beginning of the presentation that our statewide colleague was saying, hey, don't forecast the compounded scenario you don't know. So that's what we know today. We also know that CARES Act money is supposed to last us through all of next school year. So a 10% cut in state aid to start next school year, and they would likely take it over the 12 months, could be 16 or 17 or more $1 million, just to put into perspective. And so as Derek was talking about this year and expenses that we could recode and into next year, I can't imagine that there is a scenario where we won't need additional help. I can't imagine a scenario that we will be better off financially because of COVID-19 and federal dollars. I couldn't, in my professional capacity, say, yes, let's draw down the whole 10 million. We'll sit in cash. We'll balance our books for this year and next, and we'll be okay. Meaning we won't have any additional expenses that are unplanned for, or it would push off the future need for a levy. So again, just here's how my brain thinks. And I, think about how we talk about this in next week's presentation. If we received a 10% cut in state aid, between 16 and 17 or $18 million of state budget reduction, starting July 1, on top of the $3.5 million that we've already been cut. The CARES Act is only $9.8 million. And that is supposed to last us from March 13th through next school year. I would like to think that there would be an additional federal incentive or Recovery Act, but I don't know. I really, that's not anything that I can forecast at this point in time.
Well, even if there is, the battle right now between whether or not that will help state and local governments and will be included is still raging. So, yeah, we may or may not be able to count on any help from them.
Right.
Ryan, I have a question. So I know you may not be able to have exact numbers on this, but what areas in our budget do you guesstimate where we've been under budget, where we've, I guess, saved throughout this whole predicament?
Yeah, good question. Let me see if I can bring that up. And I can share that with you. Okay, present now. Entire screen. Okay, does everybody see this really busy spreadsheet?
Yes.
Okay, great. This is March and April, Ms. Autry, and these are the non-personnel costs. So far left, remember in our early orientation finance committees, remember those object level that we were talking about in the account code structure? So these are purchase services, supplies and materials, capital, and all other. And these are the major object levels that I looked at March of 19 versus March of 20 and what kind of budget delta we're looking at. Some are higher, some are lower, and why. And then I've got my accounting staff kind of looking into the whys. And again, I'll add a little bit more detail before next week.
Oh,
But this is basically what I have. It's basically 2 months of data that I have. You'll see a major delta component of, let's see here, where are the big ones? Let's look at the month of April. So in purchase services, we were running about $468,000 under budget from April of 19's comparison month to month. And as I look down through here, I get a instructional component of 244,000. Here's a direct relationship to COVID. We were down on purchase service transportation. So this would be, to Dr. Hall's question in the beginning, this would be transportation that we're providing outside of the district for students of choice. Just for the month of April, we were $260,000 under budget. We look at supplies and materials. Here's the month of April. Interestingly, last month we were $137,000 under budget. This month we're almost $40,000 over budget. That's inconclusive to me to say it looks like the timing of a textbook adoption, or maybe we had an update to a digital subscription. Capital. Looks like we had a large capital expenditure. The superintendent and I have pretty much locked down all equipment purchases. So this could have been a typical month where we would have spent that kind of equipment line item. So we'll take a little bit more detailed look there, but we're running $330,000 under budget. And then for all other 160, but overall, we've got a trend here of running about $500,000 under budget with a grand total for those 2 months of $996,000. It's real money, but it's also very difficult to gauge any real long-term trend there. I talked to the Department of Education about this. It was helpful to hear them say, hey, this part of the year, our assessments are going out, our testing's going out. We don't have nearly the cost with managing all those kind of things. But then he said, on the other hand, we've got all this field support over time for supporting our area coordinators and helping districts with excess cost and catastrophic. So it's hard to get a feel for it. When you get down to it also, it's not moving the needle on the trend, at least not right now. We'll get another month's worth of data in there for May and then June before we close out the fiscal year, and let's talk about that more in Finance Committee. Good question. Any other questions on the forecast? Thanks for sticking with me on all those spreadsheets. That's why I like to do a PowerPoint at the high level, and then you'll get a lot of the supporting documentation this week to pour over. And then we'll have another committee meeting prior to the board meeting next Monday night in case we want to get some additional details. Okay, I see Dr. Akbar talking, but I don't hear him. Does anybody else? I still don't hear him. No?
Hear me.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear. I just heard Patrick and David.
This is Derek. Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you. I can hear Dr. Akbar. I'm trying to watch everybody for hands going up, and Dr. Akbar, if you want to submit a question on the chat, yeah, make sure we give you the chance to do that before we move on. I just had one more agenda item, unless you guys did. Now he's Dr. Akbar's frozen on my screen now. Yeah. Okay, well, he's submitting his question. I'll watch for that. I'll send you a Dear Board Member letter, consulting service change that we're asking for. This has been more than 10 years. There was a law change for 403B vendors. Oh, it looks like Dr. Akbar is texting me. Yeah, it says his screen is frozen. Sorry about that, but we'll stay on to answer any questions. And the Dear Board Member letter, this is really just an introduction unless you want to talk more about this. Hold on a second, I'm going to present my write-up. The PSA Consulting Group, we'd like to approve a contract there where it allows a 403B plan administrator. It allows this group to evaluate updates to 403B, ERISA, IRS
Patrick,
laws
you
and
need
changes.
to mute your microphone, Patrick.
And then it allows them to be up to date and advise our employees in a more electronic and proactive fashion. So right now, either myself or the assistant treasurer serve as the 403B plan administrator. And so the plan administrator reviews all withdrawals, deposits, deductions, those kind of things. We will still manage the deposits, deductions on checks, and the contractual components of the union contracts. What we will not do under this plan administrator document is if there are loans, distributions, rollover, hardship withdrawals, required minimum distributions, they will manage that process for us. There's a $2 per employee per month fee that is paid for by the consultants. It is not paid for by us. It's part of their, part of how they collect fees through their regular employees. I would say, just so folks know about this, or if I can answer any questions before next week, we're a late adopter to this, partially because we have a larger staff than a lot of districts do. They've contracted these services out over a period of years. And it's just now to the extent where there's a number of vendors in this space where there's no cost to us to manage it. And frankly, it's more efficient for our employees and more timely. People are still, in today's environment of what we offer, when they do a 403B withdrawal, they have to physically come into our office. We have to interview them so that the withdrawal meets a certain set of circumstances. And that is sometimes a very uncomfortable thing to do when the assistant treasurer is asking them about a hardship withdrawal. And they say, why do you need to know this? And we're saying, because the law requires us to do so. And if we have a plan administrator, it's a little bit more independent. And frankly, they're the professionals at it. So that's what this document's for. I'll put this in a Dear Board Member letter. And if you have questions throughout the remaining part of this week leading up to next week, and a copy of that contract, you can see it. I think it may even be posted already. That's what I had for today's agenda. Anything else that you want me to work on for next week's board meeting? I see Dr. Akbar's back and not frozen. Did we get to all your questions, sir? Still can't hear you. Oh my goodness. Oh no. Okay. Well, I'll follow up offline with you.
I'm not sure what's
Okay. Thanks
Ryan, this
for
is very helpful. I appreciate it. Yeah, I don't have anything else. This is Derek. I don't have anything else. I think this was a great meeting. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for the assistance in this presentation.
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay, see you all next Finance Committee next Monday. Take care and be safe.
Thank you.
Thanks,
See you
Ryan.
too.
Thanks, Ryan. Have a good night.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.